If you have a few pieces of scrap hardwood, some wood glue, epoxy, and a few dozen Pokémon cards you don't mind destroying, then you might be able to create your own fun custom game board. Built with the Pokémon theme in mind, it's perfect for game nights and brings a fun custom flair to your space. Day 1. For me, starting a project usually involves a bit of rummaging. I tend to kick around some scrap wood, maybe dig through a bin or two, until I finally unearth just the right pieces. Often things I didn't even know I was looking for. This time, I struck gold with 7 random pieces of scrap hardwood flooring. Back in the workshop, first things first, I checked each piece for any stray metal or big knots. Those things can really mess up your planer blades, trust me. I ran the unfinished side of the hardwood through the planer a few times to get it nice and smooth, then glued them together, using clamps to hold everything tight at the joints. I gave it about an hour for the glue to mostly dry. Wood glue can be impatient. Day 1. Cut. Since I'm planning to pour epoxy over the unfinished side, I needed a way to keep it all from spilling everywhere. Back to the scrap pile. I found a picture frame, the kind that used to hold a canvas print. My glued hardwood pieces were a little bigger than the frame. I had to trim off the extra and square everything up. I laid the frame on top of my hardwood and traced the inside edge onto the wood. Next up, I used a table saw to cut along those lines, both across and lengthwise, getting rid of the excess wood. Then, I flipped the hardwood over to the unfinished side, which will be the bottom, and filled any cracks and seams with hot glue. I scraped off any extra glue from the surface to keep it relatively clean. Once I made absolutely sure my workbench was level, I placed the hardwood, unfinished side up, inside the wooden frame. Day 1, end. Now, for the epoxy. I mixed up 4 cups total, that's 2 cups of part A and 2 cups of part B, stirring gently for a good 2 minutes and making sure to scrape the bottom and sides of the mixing cup. Then, I poured in about half of it, spreading it out evenly before carefully laying down my first layer of Pokémon cards. I placed each card at a bit of an angle. This helped stop air from getting trapped underneath, and tried to cover as much wood as I could. Using a squeegee, I pressed down firmly, swiping in all directions to push out any extra epoxy from under the cards. For the second layer, I put the cards down in the opposite direction, lining them up over the edges of the cards underneath. Squeegee time again. Pressed them down to spread the epoxy evenly across the surface. For the third and fourth layers, I just went random with the cards and poured the rest of the epoxy on top, using the squeegee as I went to make sure everything was coated. Inevitably, little air bubbles popped up from the cracks and around the cards. A quick pass with a heat gun took care of those, leaving the finish crystal clear. Then, I just let the whole thing sit overnight to harden up. Day 2. First thing in the morning, I noticed something cool. A few cards had floated up a little higher than the rest, giving it a 3D effect. The whole surface was coated in epoxy, but because of those floating cards, it wasn't perfectly flat. Actually, that's totally fine, because I was planning a final epoxy coat anyway to smooth out the top and keep that awesome 3D look. Time to remove the wooden frame. I grabbed a hammer and chisel and gently worked them around to pop the frame off. Then, I cut some cardboard strips to the same length and width as my piece. I hot glued them together around the sides, and then ran a bead of hot glue along the bottom seam, where the cardboard met the hardwood. This sealed the edges up tight, and kept the epoxy from leaking everywhere during the next pour. This time, I mixed up a little less epoxy. 3 cups total, 1.5 cups of part A, and 1.5 cups of part B. I poured it over the card-covered surface. Using my trusty squeegee and some patience, I spread the epoxy out evenly. Then, one last pass with the heat gun to banish any bubbles and get that crystal clear top coat. Done for the day. Day 3. I started by peeling off as much of the cardboard frame as I could. Good news, my hot glue seal along the bottom edges worked perfectly. Then, it was back to the table saw to clean up the edges and get rid of the leftover wood from the picture frame and the cardboard. I took off about a 1/4 inch from all 4 sides to start. Then, I ran it through again, taking off another 1/4 inch, just making sure everything was nice and square. I set it aside to cure completely. You really want to give epoxy a full 72 hours to harden properly, while I started thinking about lights and a frame for the final product. Day 4. That's pretty much it. If you'd like to protect the edges of your board, consider adding a hardwood frame with a routed inner edge to fit snugly over the top. This would give it a little lip over the epoxy, protecting the edge, and also helping to keep cards from sliding off when playing. That epoxy top is pretty slick. I also had this idea about adding some LEDs, maybe randomly placed inside the outer frame. Because the light shines right through the epoxy, it'd highlight the cards underneath without being too bright on top. A pretty cool effect.